Borzou Daragahi is now here with me. He's the Middle East correspondent for BuzzFeed and a former Pulitzer Prize finalist. Borzou, many thanks for joining us here on TRT World for this Mosul special. This is clearly going to be a long, hard slog. We're in day 9 of the offensive now. What do you think offensive forces should be most worried about?
Well, I think that they are most worried about booby traps, roadside bombs, little tricks, mines that that Daesh has left for the advancing Iraqi troops and Kurdish Peshmerga and other forces.
Those are all fairly typical Daesh forms of combat, though, aren't they?
Yeah, absolutely. And you know what? Some of the things they do is, for example, they'll put a bomb in a doll or an item of food or clothing and so on. And so the soldier will pick it up and it will blow up and kill them. And I think that's the main concern that they have right now. This is why the
Americans and the British have been brought in to try and advise them on how to fight these.
They have the Iraqis have their own explosive ordnance disposal teams, but absolutely they need outside help for this kind of thing. Specialized outside help is exactly what they need when it comes to these kind of sophisticated devices.
Okay, so as far as the offensive is concerned, I mean, how long do you see before taking Mosul is a viable reality?
Well, I mean,
notwithstanding the fact that the project afterwards is a big deal as well.
It's been 9 days, and I mean, you looked at the same footage I looked at. I mean, they're basically taking gas stations in the desert. You know, I mean, they're still not near even what I would call the suburbs of Mosul.
Is this the phony war then? Is that?
I wouldn't call it a phony war. I would just call it they're still on the outskirts. They're still slowly moving towards, and they're taking these villages in Nineveh province that were fairly easy to take. Obviously, Daesh has moved most of its forces from these peripheral areas into the center of the city, and that's where you're going to have the real trouble and the real potential for violence.
What's Daesh's overall tactic then, not in terms of their actual fighting methods, but rather in terms of their strategy to try and keep the city?
You know, it's hard to determine right now whether they actually expect to keep the city.
You think they might not?
They might not want to keep the city, but they might want to give the Iraqi government and the forces arrayed against them a big black eye in the process of letting it go and dissolving. I think that they're prepared for the eventuality that they will no longer control this big, huge piece of territory in Iraq, but for their own pride, for their propaganda, they have to try to put up a good fight.
In terms of Mosul itself, we know that the UN has warned of an impending humanitarian crisis. Estimates of up to 1 million people from the city, of only 1.5 million people who currently live there, could have to be evacuated. How critical is it going to be in managing the aftermath of that for these offensive forces? I mean,
it's going to depend on how this fight looks. If at one point Daesh slips away into the desert, heads towards Syria, leaves the city on its own, then basically you won't have a huge humanitarian crisis. The Iraqi government has called upon people at this point to stay in their homes if they can and allow the city to be liberated and not to head out. If there is street-to-street, house-to-house fighting, people are going to load up their goods into their little cars and head out, and that's going to be the crisis.
And just quickly, lastly of all, the sectarian element of this, in terms of the offensive forces as well as the Daesh element, is a concern for a lot of people who are trying to manage everybody that's working together in this allied offense, isn't it?
Yeah, I mean, that is a huge concern, that you're going to have these notorious Shia militias processing people during or after this battle and deciding who is a collaborator, who wasn't. But I should say that, I was recently in Anbar province, and even among the various Sunni tribes, you had this problem. So that you had some Sunni tribes saying that tribe was collaborating with ISIS, and they would take the law into their own hands and so on. So there's a Shia-Sunni element to the potential for violence, but there's also an intra-Sunni aspect as well. Some Sunnis collaborated with ISIS, some didn't, and that's going to be trouble afterward.
Okay, all right. Well, Borzou Daragahi, we will leave it there, of course. More news.